A carefully crafted life can be shattered by a single, heartless laugh. For Catherine Vance, that laughter echoed in her pristine, art-filled home, coming from her husband and the woman he was flaunting in her face. They called her hobby pathetic, her dreams worthless, and her future a joke. They left her with nothing but the shards of a broken vase and a broken heart. But what happens when a woman who has given up everything is left with nothing to lose? This is the story of how that mockery became the fuel for a revolution, and how the forgotten wife built a millionaire empire from the ashes of her marriage. The air in the sprawling Greenwich, Connecticut home was thick with the scent of roasted duck and expensive perfume. Crystal glasses chimed a counterpoint to the low murmur of sophisticated conversation. This was Catherine Vance's life, or rather the life she curated for her husband, Richard Vance, a senior vice president at Sterling Thorne Investments. She had designed the minimalist interior, chosen the abstract art that adorned the walls, and planned tonight's dinner party with the meticulous precision of a military strategist. She was the perfect corporate wife, elegant, quiet, and utterly invisible. Her invisibility was never more apparent than tonight. Richard was holding court at the head of the long mahogany table, his booming laugh filling the room. Seated far too close to him, practically nestled under his arm, was Tiffany Sterling. Her name was an irony not lost on Catherine. Tiffany was the daughter of the firm's founding partner, a woman whose ambition was as sharp and cold as the diamonds glittering at her throat. She was everything Catherine was not: loud, overtly flirtatious, and dripping with a sense of entitlement that poisoned the air around her. She was also, as everyone in their circle pretended not to know Richard's mistress. Catherine moved through the room, with a practiced smile refilling glasses and ensuring her guests were comfortable. She tried to ignore the way Richard's hand rested on the small of Tiffany's back, the way they shared private jokes that excluded everyone, especially her. For years, Catherine had swallowed her pain, telling herself this was the price of the life Richard provided. She had given up her own aspirations, a small but promising career in ceramic arts, to support his climb up the corporate ladder. She had managed their homes, raised their now college-aged son, and hosted countless evenings like this one, all to bolster his image. In return, she had been relegated to the role of a household accessory. The humiliation, however, was about to escalate from a quiet ache to a public spectacle. After dinner, as guests mingled in the living room, Tiffany wandered over to a pedestal in the corner. Upon it sat Catherine's latest creation, a large crystalline glazed ceramic vase, its surface a swirling nebula of cobalt blue and volcanic black. It was the one piece of herself she allowed to exist in this sterile, Richard-approved environment. She had spent months perfecting the glaze, a technique she had developed herself. It was her pride, her secret joy. "Oh, what's this little thing?" Tiffany asked, her voice dripping with condescension. She picked it up, her long, manicured nails tapping against the delicate surface. "That's one of my wife's projects," Richard said, walking over. He used the word projects as if describing a child's finger painting. She likes to keep herself busy in her little studio. Catherine felt a familiar knot of shame and anger tighten in her stomach. "Please be careful with that, Tiffany," she said, her voice softer than she intended. Tiffany shot a sly look at Richard. "It's rather rustic, isn't it? Like something you'd find at a country fair." She feigned a stumble, her hand losing its grip. The vase plummeted to the polished oak floor, exploding into 100 glittering shards. A collective gasp filled the room. Silence descended. Catherine stared at the wreckage of her art, her heart hammering against her ribs. It wasn't just a vase. It was a symbol of her soul, her passion shattered on the floor of her own home. Tiffany brought a hand to her mouth in a parody of shock. "Oh my goodness, I am so clumsy, Richard darling. I'm terribly sorry." Richard, instead of showing an ounce of concern for his wife's feelings, let out a short, sharp laugh. He wrapped an arm around Tiffany's shoulders, pulling her into a comforting hug. "Don't you worry about a thing, Tiff. It's just some pottery." He then turned his gaze to Catherine, his eyes cold and dismissive. "Honestly, Catherine, you shouldn't leave your clutter out when we have guests. Tiffany's done us a favor. Now we have an excuse to buy some actual art for that corner." The laughter that followed Richard's cruel bark and Tiffany's high-pitched titter was the sound of Catherine's world collapsing. The guests shuffled their feet, their averted eyes a testament to their complicity. No one defended her. No one offered a word of comfort. In that moment, she was utterly alone, a ghost in her own life. She looked from the broken pieces on the floor to the smirking faces of her husband and his mistress. They weren't just breaking a vase. They were breaking her piece by piece and laughing as they did it. The polite smile she had worn for 2 decades finally cracked. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. A strange, terrifying calm washed over her. She met Richard's gaze, her own eyes for the first time in years, devoid of fear or deference. She held it until his smirk faltered, until he saw something in her he didn't recognize. Without a word, she turned and walked away from the wreckage, away from her guests, and up the grand staircase. Each step was a silent vow. This was not just the end of a vase. It was the end of Catherine Vance, the dutiful wife. And from those shards, someone new, someone infinitely stronger, was about to be born. The laughter from downstairs faded, replaced by the deafening roar of a fire being kindled within her. The door to the master suite clicked shut behind Catherine, the sound definitive. For a moment, she leaned against the cool wood, her body trembling not with sorrow, but with a white-hot rage that seemed to sear the very air she breathed. The muffled sounds of the party continuing downstairs were an insult, a confirmation of her complete and utter irrelevance in the life she had helped build. She didn't pack frantically. Her movements were deliberate, almost serene. She opened the walk-in closet, a space larger than some apartments, and bypassed the rows of designer dresses and handbags Richard had bought her costumes for a role she would no longer play. Instead, she pulled out a single worn duffel bag from the back. Into it went practical clothes, her personal laptop, a small box of treasured family photos, and her detailed journals filled with glaze formulas and design sketches, the blueprints of her true self. She paused at her vanity, staring at her reflection. The woman looking back was a stranger, with tired eyes and a face etched with the quiet desperation of 1,000 compromises. She picked up a framed photo of her and Richard on their wedding day, 2 young people full of hope. With cold precision, she removed the photo, tore it neatly in half, and let the pieces fall into the wastebasket. Downstairs, Richard eventually came looking for her, his patience with her melodrama clearly at an end. He found her standing by the door duffel bag at her feet. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice low and menacing. "You embarrassed me, Catherine, walking out on our guests like that." "Your guests, Richard," she corrected him, her voice even and clear. "Just like it's your house and your life. I'm done being an uncredited producer in it." He scoffed, a look of genuine disbelief on his face. "Don't be ridiculous. Where do you think you're going? Back to your mother's in Ohio? You have nothing. Everything you are, everything you have is because of me." It was the line he had used to keep her in her gilded cage for years. But tonight the bars had melted away. "You're wrong," she said, a flicker of a smile playing on her lips. "I have nothing to lose. There's a significant difference." Before he could process her words, she walked out the door, not even glancing back at the man who had been the center of her universe for 22 years. The click of the front door closing behind her was a gunshot signaling the start of a new life. The first few weeks were a brutal re-entry into a world she had long since left. The joint bank accounts were frozen within hours. The credit cards were cancelled. Richard was making a point, ensuring her departure was as painful as possible. Catherine used the last of her personal savings, a small inheritance she'd kept hidden away, to rent a tiny third-floor walk-up apartment in a less fashionable part of Stamford. The contrast was jarring. The constant sound of sins replaced the gentle birdsong of Greenwich. The smell of exhaust fumes replaced the scent of her manicured rose garden. For 3 days, she did nothing but sit on the lumpy second-hand sofa, staring at the peeling paint on the walls. The rage had subsided, leaving behind a vast, terrifying emptiness. Richard's words echoed in her mind. "You have nothing." Was he right? On the 4th day, as the sun streamed through the grimy window, it illuminated the box containing her journals. Hesitantly, she opened them. Page after page of her neat handwriting, her intricate chemical formulas for glazes, her sketches for new forms. This wasn't nothing. This was her. A spark ignited within the emptiness. It was small, fragile, but it was there. She took her laptop to the local library and spent hours researching. She studied online marketplaces branding small business loans and supply chains. She learned about SEO and social media marketing worlds that had been utterly alien to her. Her first investment was a used potter's wheel and a small second-hand kiln that took up nearly a quarter of her tiny living room. The landlord was not pleased, but Catherine, armed with a newfound assertiveness, negotiated an agreement. The apartment became a makeshift studio. Days were spent covered in clay. Her hands, once soft and manicured, now calloused and strong. Nights were spent at her laptop building a simple but elegant website for her nascent brand, which she named Aura and Hearth. The name represented her new philosophy, creating items that brought a unique energy and a sense of warmth and sanctuary to a space. She started small, creating a line of intensely aromatic scented candles poured into her own handmade ceramic vessels. Each scent was complex and evocative, inspired by memories she was reclaiming as her own sea salt driftwood and cypress-spiced apple cedar and fallen leaves and worn leather vanilla and sandalwood. Her first sale came a month later from a stranger in Oregon who had found her website through a niche home decor blog. Catherine stared at the notification from her payment processor, her eyes welling with tears. It was only $45, but it felt like $1 million. It was money she had earned herself from something she had created with her own hands and mind. It was validation in its purest form. She reinvested every penny. She rented a small stall at a weekend farmer's market. Standing there surrounded by vendors selling organic kale and artisanal cheese, she felt a terrifying vulnerability. What if people hated her work? What if they laughed just as Tiffany and Richard had? An older woman with kind eyes stopped at her stall. She picked up a reading nook candle, closed her eyes, and inhaled deeply. "Oh my," she whispered. "This smells exactly like my late husband's study. It's wonderful." She bought 3. Throughout the day, more people came. They were drawn in by the unique beauty of the ceramic vessels and stayed for the captivating scents. They didn't see a little project or clutter. They saw art. They saw quality. By the end of the day, she had sold nearly her entire stock. Driving home in her beat-up car, the empty boxes rattling in the back, Catherine didn't feel tired. She felt electrified. The embers of the fire Richard had tried to extinguish were now burning brightly. This wasn't just a hobby anymore. This was a business. This was her future. And she was building it, one candle, one sale, one believer at a time. She had a long way to go, but for the first time in over 2 decades, she was walking on a path she had paved for herself. The next 6 months were a grueling, relentless grind. Catherine operated on a perpetual cycle of creating, marketing, and selling. Her apartment was a chaotic symphony of production shelves, crowded with cooling pottery, the air thick with a rotating blend of fragrance oils and shipping boxes stacked high in the hallway. Sleep became a luxury. Her social life was non-existent. But with every positive review and every repeat customer, her confidence grew. Aura and Hearth was building a small but fiercely loyal following online. Her aesthetic minimalist elegance meets handcrafted warmth was resonating with people tired of mass-produced goods. But Catherine knew that to truly grow, to transform her micro-business into something substantial, she needed a bigger stage. Farmers' markets and online sales were a start, but they couldn't provide the quantum leap she needed. She was approaching a ceiling limited by her production capacity and her reach. She needed a wholesale account, a partnership that could provide a steady stream of revenue and lend her brand a seal of legitimacy. Her research led her to the Lux Connect trade show, an exclusive invitation-only event held annually in New York City. It was where high-end brands met with buyers from luxury hotels, boutique chains, and upscale department stores. Getting in was the first hurdle. The application fee alone was staggering, and she needed to submit a professional portfolio and references which she didn't have. Taking a massive gamble, Catherine spent nearly a third of her business savings to hire a professional photographer and a graphic designer to create a stunning digital lookbook. She poured her heart into the application essay, telling the story of Aura and Hearth, not as a corporation, but as an artisan-led passion project dedicated to the craft of sensory experience. She sent it off, her hopes pinned on a single email. Weeks went by. She had almost given up when the acceptance letter arrived. She had been granted a spot on the waiting list, and a last-minute cancellation had opened up a small booth in a far-flung corner of the exhibition hall. The 3-day event was an overwhelming onslaught of noise, glamour, and ruthless commerce. Her tiny booth, which she'd painstakingly designed with reclaimed wood and soft lighting, felt like a rowboat in a sea of battleships. She was surrounded by massive, glittering displays from established international brands. Buyers in impeccably tailored suits swept past her, their eyes scanning for big names, barely giving her a second glance. By the afternoon of the second day, Catherine was deeply discouraged. She had handed out dozens of samples and brochures, but had received little more than polite, dismissive smiles. The cost of the booth, the travel, the materials, it felt like a catastrophic miscalculation. She was watching her dream bleed money. As she was about to start packing up a few samples to conserve them, a woman stopped in front of her booth. She was in her late 50s with a sharp silver bob and intelligent, assessing eyes. Her suit was Chanel. Her demeanor exuded an effortless authority that made people take notice. Her name badge read, Genevieve Dubois, Global Director of Procurement, the Serafina Hotel Group. Catherine's heart leaped into her throat. The Serafina Group was the absolute pinnacle of luxury hospitality, with 5-star properties in every major city in the world. They were legendary for their attention to detail and their commitment to unique guest experiences. Genevieve's gaze swept over the booth, her expression unreadable. She didn't look at Catherine. She looked at the products. She picked up a heavy, dark grey ceramic vessel containing the Midnight Jasmine candle. She examined the texture of the glaze, the clean lines of the form, the quality of the wooden wick. "Who does your ceramics?" Genevieve asked, her voice carrying a faint, elegant French accent. "I do," Catherine replied, trying to keep her own voice steady. "I design and craft every piece myself." Genevieve raised a skeptical eyebrow. She ran a thumb over the smooth, unglazed bottom of the vessel, where Catherine's small, discreet maker's mark, A&H, was stamped. Then she brought the candle to her nose, closing her eyes as she inhaled. Her severe expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "This is not your standard hotel fragrance," she stated. "There are layers. Tuberose, a hint of clove, something green, vetiver, and a touch of black pepper to cut the sweetness," Catherine added, amazed that she had dissected the complex scent so accurately. Genevieve put the candle down. "The market is saturated with so-called luxury candles. Most of them are cheaply made paraffin wax, with synthetic fragrances that smell of chemicals and desperation. What makes you different?" This was her moment. Catherine took a deep breath, pushing aside her fear and exhaustion. "Because I'm not selling a product, Madame Dubois. I'm selling a feeling. The feeling of stepping into a room and it instantly feeling like a sanctuary. Our scents are designed to evoke memories, not just to mask odors. Our vessels are designed to be kept as objects of art long after the candle is gone. We use a proprietary blend of soy and coconut wax, the finest essential oils, and every single item is handcrafted. It's not scalable in the traditional sense because you cannot mass-produce soul." She spoke with a passion and conviction she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't a timid wife anymore. She was the founder and creator of Aura and Hearth. Genevieve was silent for a long time, her eyes boring into Catherine. She picked up another scent, Fireside Library, and smelled it. Then another Mediterranean citrus. Finally, she looked directly at Catherine. "The Serafina Group is launching a new line of exclusive residential suites at our flagship properties in New York, London, and Tokyo. We are looking for a unique, signature scent amenity package for our most discerning clients. Something no one else has." She paused, placing her business card deliberately on the counter. "My office will be in touch to request a full sample line and a proposal. Do not disappoint me, Miss Vance." And with that, she turned and walked away, disappearing back into the crowd. Catherine stared at the small, cream-colored card as if it were a winning lottery ticket. Her hands were shaking. In a sea of giants, the most powerful person in the room had not only noticed her little rowboat, but had seen the value in what it carried. This wasn't just a wholesale account. It was a partnership with a global tastemaker. It was the key that could unlock the door to her empire. The scent of opportunity was real, and it smelled like jasmine vetiver and the sweet, sweet promise of success. The call from Genevieve Dubois' office came 2 days later. The proposal request was daunting. The Serafina Group needed a comprehensive plan for an exclusive co-branded line of products. A signature candle, a room spray, reed diffusers, and a line of bath amenities, all built around a completely new bespoke fragrance. They also required a detailed production plan, scalability projections, and a pricing structure. This was leagues beyond pouring candles in her apartment. This was corporate-level manufacturing. Panic and exhilaration warred within Catherine. She knew she couldn't do this alone. Her artistry had gotten her this far, but she lacked the business acumen to navigate a deal of this magnitude. Swallowing her pride, she reached out to the one person she knew who might be able to help. David Chen was a retired business consultant who had been a regular and very inquisitive customer at her farmer's market stall. He had been semi-retired for years, but she had sensed a sharp, analytical mind behind his friendly questions about her profit margins and supply costs. She met him at a coffee shop, laying out the entire situation, her vulnerability on full display. She expected him to politely decline. Instead, David's eyes lit up with a familiar, competitive fire. The challenge intrigued him. "Catherine," he said, leaning forward after she finished, "what you have is the most valuable asset in modern luxury authenticity. The big brands spend billions trying to fake it. You are the real deal. But authenticity without infrastructure is just a charming hobby. You're about to go to war with the giants. You need an arsenal." David agreed to come on as a consultant and later a partner for a stake in the company. He became the architect of her expansion. His first move was to secure funding. He bypassed traditional banks who would have balked at her lack of credit history and instead leveraged his network to connect with a small group of angel investors who specialized in female-founded artisan brands. Armed with the Serafina proposal and David's airtight financial projections, Catherine pitched her vision. She didn't just talk about candles. She talked about creating multi-sensory experiences. She spoke of Aura and Hearth as a lifestyle brand dedicated to mindful luxury. Her passion was palpable. Her product was undeniable. They secured a seed round of funding that was more money than Catherine had ever seen in her life. The next few months were a blur of frantic, exhilarating activity. They leased a 5,000-square-foot warehouse space in an industrial part of Bridgeport, transforming it from a dusty shell into a state-of-the-art workshop. The tiny kiln from her apartment was replaced by a row of massive, digitally controlled industrial kilns. They hired a team of skilled potters to help her scale up vessel production technicians to manage the candle pouring and scent mixing, and a small administrative staff to handle logistics. Catherine was no longer just an artist. She was a CEO. She was in the workshop at dawn, her hands still covered in clay, as she perfected the new vessel designs for Serafina. And she was in the boardroom late at night with David, poring over spreadsheets and supply chain logistics. She was firm but fair with her new employees, fostering a culture of craftsmanship and mutual respect. She insisted on the highest quality ingredients, refusing to cut corners, even when it would have been more profitable. The bespoke scent she developed for Serafina was a masterpiece. She named it Elysian Dusk, a complex blend of rare osmanthus, black cardamom amber, and a subtle top note of bergamot. It was sophisticated, unique, and utterly intoxicating. When she presented the final line to Genevieve Dubois and her team in their polished Manhattan headquarters, the reaction was unanimous approval. They signed a 3-year exclusive contract that was staggering in its value. The launch of the Serafina residential suites, featuring the Elysian Dusk line by Aura and Hearth, was a major media event. Suddenly, Catherine's brand was being mentioned in the pages of Condé Nast Traveller Architectural Digest and Forbes. The story of the scorned wife who built a luxury brand from scratch was irresistible to journalists. Aura and Hearth became an overnight sensation. Website traffic exploded. Orders poured in from all over the world. Other luxury hotel groups and high-end retailers like Neiman Marcus and Harrods came calling, wanting their own exclusive lines. Under David's guidance, they expanded strategically, careful not to dilute the brand's artisan identity. They launched a direct-to-consumer subscription service that sold out in hours. Catherine Vance, the woman who had been told her little project was clutter, was now the creative force and majority owner of a rapidly growing multi-million-dollar empire. She moved out of the cramped Stamford apartment and into a beautiful penthouse in the City One with a private terrace and a breathtaking view of the skyline. She didn't buy it to show off. She bought it because the sweeping vista reminded her that there were no ceilings, no limits to how high she could climb. One evening, standing on her terrace, a glass of wine in her hand, she looked at the glittering city below. The lights twinkled like a sea of possibilities. She thought of the woman she used to be, the one who measured her worth by her husband's approval. She felt a pang of pity for her, but no regret. That woman had to break, so this one could be forged. The empire she was building wasn't just made of candles and ceramics. It was built from the shards of her old life, reassembled into something stronger, brighter, and infinitely more valuable. While Catherine's star ascended, Richard Vance's world was in a state of precipitous decline. The universe, it seemed, had a keen sense of irony. Richard, who had always prided himself on his financial genius and his infallible gut, had made a catastrophic error in judgment. Convinced he had spotted the next big thing, he had leveraged his position at Sterling Thorne to pour an enormous amount of the firm's capital and a significant portion of his own personal wealth into a highly volatile biotech startup. He had ignored the warnings from his risk analysis team, blinded by arrogance and greed. The startup, built on falsified research data, collapsed spectacularly. The news broke, sending shockwaves through the financial world. The SEC launched an investigation. Sterling Thorne, facing massive losses and a public relations nightmare, needed a scapegoat. Richard was fired unceremoniously. His nameplate scraped off his office door before he had even packed his personal belongings. He was a pariah on Wall Street, his reputation destroyed overnight. The financial fallout was brutal. His assets were frozen pending the investigation. The lavish lifestyle he had cultivated came to a screeching halt. The Greenwich mansion, now a symbol of his hubris, was slapped with a lien. The sports cars were repossessed. The endless flow of money that had defined his existence had been cut off at the source. Tiffany Sterling, the woman for whom he had so cruelly discarded his wife, proved to have the loyalty of a shark smelling blood in the water. Her affection, it turned out, was directly correlated to the balance of his bank account. With his fortune gone and his name now a synonym for failure, she vanished from his life as quickly as she had appeared, leaving behind nothing but a few expensive dresses in the closet and a mountain of bills he could no longer pay. She was, after all, a Sterling. Her allegiance was to the firm and to her own self-preservation. Richard was left rattling around in the cavernous empty mansion, a ghost in the museum of his former life. The silence was deafening. He was forced to sell off art and furniture to pay his mounting legal bills. The society friends who had once clamored for his dinner party invitations now crossed the street to avoid him. He was alone, humiliated, and rapidly running out of options. It was during a late-night whiskey-fueled session of doom-scrolling that he saw it. An online feature in Vogue Business titled The Alchemist of Ambience: How Catherine Vance Built Aura and Hearth into a Global Sensation. He clicked the link, his hand trembling slightly. The article featured a stunning photograph of Catherine in her bustling, light-filled workshop. She looked radiant, powerful. She was surrounded by her employees, exuding a quiet confidence that he had never seen in her. The article detailed her brand's meteoric rise, the landmark deal with the Serafina Group, the celebrity endorsements, and the projected annual revenue, a figure that made him choke on his drink. He read about her philosophy of mindful luxury, her commitment to craftsmanship, her inspiring story of starting over. The article painted her as a visionary, an icon of female empowerment. There was a brief, tactful mention of her past life as a corporate wife in Connecticut, framing her divorce as the catalyst for her creative rebirth. A toxic cocktail of emotions churned in Richard's gut: disbelief, envy, and a bitter, resentful rage. This was his Catherine, the quiet, mousy woman whose biggest ambition was to win a blue ribbon at the local crafts fair. How could she have accomplished this? It was impossible. In his mind, her success was somehow an extension of him, a product of the world he had provided for her. Surely she couldn't have done it on her own. He began to spin a new narrative in his head, a delusion born of desperation. He had been the one to push her, to challenge her. His criticism, his mockery, that had been the tough love she needed to finally get serious. The money she started with must have been money she'd siphoned from their joint accounts before he could freeze them. He had, in essence, been her first investor. He was the unsung hero of her story. This twisted logic took root, growing into a conviction. He wasn't just a failure. He was a victim. She owed him. She owed him for the years he supported her, for the lifestyle that gave her the time for her hobbies, for the very inspiration that her brand story was built upon. The more he thought about it, the more righteous his anger became. He was Richard Vance. He didn't fail. He didn't beg. He took what was his, and in his warped reality, a significant piece of Catherine's newfound empire belonged to him. The ghost of the gilded cage decided it was time to come rattling to remind the world, and especially his ex-wife, who was truly in charge. He just needed to find the right moment to make his grand reappearance. The perfect moment, Richard decided, was the grand opening of the Aura and Hearth flagship store on Madison Avenue. The event was the culmination of everything Catherine had built, a physical manifestation of her empire. It was an affair designed for maximum press coverage, with a guest list that included fashion editors, hotel magnates, celebrities, and the city's most influential designers. The store itself was a work of art, a serene oasis of minimalist design, with raw concrete walls, warm oak shelving, and a central scent library where customers could experience every fragrance in the collection. Catherine moved through the glittering crowd, a vision of understated elegance in a tailored silk jumpsuit. She was no longer the invisible wife hiding in the corner. She was the radiant center of this universe, accepting congratulations and speaking passionately about her brand's future. David Chen was at her side, beaming like a proud father, and Genevieve Dubois had flown in from Paris for the occasion, her presence a powerful endorsement. Catherine felt a profound sense of peace and accomplishment. She had not only survived, she had triumphed on her own terms. The evening was in full swing when a disturbance near the entrance drew a few curious glances. A man, disheveled and smelling faintly of stale whiskey, was arguing with the security guards. He was dressed in a rumpled suit that hung loosely on his now gaunt frame. His face was pale and drawn, but his eyes burned with a feverish intensity. It was Richard. He pushed past the guards, his voice rising. "I don't need an invitation. Just tell Catherine Vance her husband is here." The use of the word husband sent a ripple through the nearby guests. A hush began to fall over the room as people turned to stare. Catherine's smile froze on her face. Seeing him there, a pathetic spectre from a life she had long since buried, felt like a violation. David moved to intercept him, but Catherine put a hand on his arm, stopping him. "It's all right, David," she said, her voice calm and steady. "I'll handle this." She walked towards Richard, her composure a stark contrast to his agitated state. The crowd parted for her, creating a silent theatrical circle around them. This was no longer a private matter. It was a public confrontation. "Richard," she said, her tone level, devoid of the emotion he had expected. "You're not welcome here." "Not welcome?" He laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "This is incredible, absolutely incredible. You build all this—" He gestured wildly around the opulent store, "on my back with my money, and I'm not welcome." Catherine's eyebrows rose slightly. "Your money, Richard? You left me with nothing. I built this with a $45 sale from a woman in Oregon." "A convenient story for the magazines," he sneered. "But we know the truth, don't we, Cat? Who paid for the house with the little studio where you played with your clay? Who funded the life that gave you the luxury of time to develop your art? I was your silent partner from the beginning. This empire was built on the foundation I provided." The audacity of his claim was breathtaking. He was trying to rewrite history, to cast himself as the magnanimous benefactor in her success story. He was trying to reclaim power in the only way he knew how, by attempting to diminish her. But the woman standing before him was not the same woman who had crumbled when he broke her vase. She looked at him not with anger, but with a profound and devastating pity. "The foundation you provided, Richard, was a cage," she said, her voice clear and carrying through the silent room. "A beautiful, comfortable cage, but a cage nonetheless. You didn't inspire me. You belittled me. You didn't support me. You mocked me. You and your mistress laughed as you broke the one thing that was mine. You thought you were breaking me, but you were setting me free." She took a step closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You didn't come here for credit, Richard. You came here for a handout. I read about what happened at Sterling Thorn. I know you're desperate." His face contorted with rage and shame. He had been seen, his pathetic motives laid bare. "You owe me," he hissed, his voice cracking. "After everything I gave you." Catherine delivered the final fatal blow, not with a shout, but with a whisper. "The only thing you ever gave me, Richard, was a reason to leave. Now, this is the launch of my business, a celebration of my hard work. You are a ghost from a past I no longer inhabit. Please have enough dignity to leave before I have you removed." She turned her back on him, then a simple final gesture of dismissal. She walked back towards her guests, leaving him standing alone in the center of the room, the weight of 100 judgmental eyes upon him. Defeated and utterly humiliated, Richard stared at her back, the back of a woman he had underestimated. A woman he had lost, a woman who had become more powerful than he could ever have imagined. He turned and slunk out of the store, disappearing into the cold anonymity of the New York night. The quiet murmur in the room slowly returned to a buzz. But this time it was laced with a newfound respect for the Empress of Aura and Hearth. The confrontation with Richard was not the climax of Catherine's story, but merely the shedding of its final unwanted skin. The incident became a brief, salacious bit of city gossip, but it faded quickly, overshadowed by the undeniable triumph of the Aura and Hearth brand. If anything, the public scene only served to crystallize Catherine's public image as a woman of immense grace and strength under pressure. Her calm, decisive dismissal of her former tormentor became a quiet legend among those who had witnessed it. In the year that followed, Aura and Hearth solidified its position as a dominant force in the luxury lifestyle market. Catherine, guided by David Chen's strategic prowess, made a series of brilliant moves. They acquired a small, sustainable apiary in upstate New York to produce their own beeswax, further enhancing their brand's commitment to natural ingredients. They launched the Hearth Foundation, a charitable arm of the company, dedicated to providing grants and mentorship to female artisans and small business owners, allowing Catherine to become the benefactor she had never had. She found a new rhythm to her life, one that was balanced and deeply fulfilling. Her days were no longer a frantic scramble for survival, but a purposeful blend of creative direction and strategic leadership. She spent mornings in the workshop, her hands in the clay, developing new forms and testing glazes, staying connected to the craft that was the soul of her company. Afternoons were for board meetings, marketing strategy sessions, and mentoring the young, ambitious women she was now able to hire and empower. She traveled the world not as a tourist, but as a creator seeking inspiration. She found new scent combinations in the spice markets of Marrakesh, new pottery techniques in the small villages of Japan, and new ideas for sustainable packaging from designers in Scandinavia. Each journey enriched her, and in turn, enriched her brand. Her penthouse was no longer just a place to live. It was a sanctuary she had designed for herself. It was filled with art. She loved books she wanted to read, and the quiet, comforting sense of her own creation. There was a new man in her life, an architect named Samuel, who was drawn to her brilliance and her resilience, not her net worth. He celebrated her strength rather than being intimidated by it, and their relationship was one of true partnership and mutual respect. One crisp autumn evening, she was standing in her office, a spacious corner suite in a downtown skyscraper that now served as Aura and Hearth's global headquarters. The view was even more spectacular than the one from her apartment, a panoramic tapestry of the city she now considered her own. On her desk lay the latest issue of Entrepreneur magazine. On the cover was a powerful, smiling portrait of her, under the headline, Catherine Vance, From Heartbreak to $100 Million Hearth. She thought for a fleeting moment of Richard. News had trickled back to her through the grapevine. After the Madison Avenue incident, he had finally lost the Greenwich house to the bank. He had taken a low-level sales job in another state, living in obscurity, a pale shadow of the titan he had once believed himself to be. She felt no malice towards him, no desire for revenge. He was simply irrelevant, a footnote in a book she had long since finished writing. Her success was not her revenge. Her happiness was. A young designer from her team knocked on the door, holding a prototype for a new vessel. Catherine turned from the window, her face lighting up with genuine enthusiasm. The ghost of the past was gone, exorcised by purpose and success. She was no longer Catherine Vance, the corporate wife. She was Catherine Vance, the founder, the CEO, the mentor, the artist. She was an empress, and this was the dawn of her reign. A kingdom built not of gold and stone, but of wax and clay, of fragrance and fire, and of the unbreakable strength of a woman who had dared to rebuild her world from the shards up. The empire ran like a well-oiled, beautifully scented machine. Aura and Hearth had just opened its first European flagship in Paris, a stone's throw from the Place Vendôme, to critical acclaim. Catherine had finalized a partnership with a renowned automaker to design a unique, subtle scent diffuser for their new luxury electric vehicle. By every conceivable metric, she was not just succeeding. She was defining the market. Yet amidst the global expansion and glowing press, there was one small, unaudited corner of her life that remained unresolved, a debt she hadn't realized was still outstanding. The notification came not via a business associate, but through a personal email with a subject line that made her heart skip a beat. Graduation. It was from her son, Leo. Throughout the tumultuous years of her divorce and the whirlwind of building her company, Leo had been a steady but distant presence at Stanford University. Their calls were regular but brief, filled with the safe topics of his coursework and her travels. They had carefully navigated around the shattered continent of their family, speaking of Richard only in the most neutral logistical terms. Now he was graduating with honors and had accepted a junior analyst position in New York, starting in the fall. The email was polite, almost formal, but the last line carried a weight that felt heavier than all the rest. Mum, once I'm settled in the city, I'd really like for us to sit down and have a real conversation. There's a lot I need to understand. A chill snaked through Catherine's usual composure. She had conquered boardrooms, won over stone-faced investors, and faced down her tormentor in a room full of onlookers. But the thought of this real conversation with her own son filled her with a unique and profound dread. Leo had been shielded from the worst of the marriage's decay away at school during the final ugly implosion. She had no idea what version of the story he had received from his father, a man now skilled in the art of self-victimization. She had built an empire of her own, but she had neglected the small, fragile kingdom of her own family. A month later they met. Leo chose the venue, a quiet, unassuming Italian restaurant in Greenwich Village, a neutral ground far from the glamour of her world and the ghosts of his father's. When he walked in, Catherine was struck by how much he had changed. The lanky teenager she remembered was gone, replaced by a young man with his father's jawline, but her own thoughtful, perceptive eyes. There was a new gravity in his posture, a weariness that didn't belong on a 22-year-old. The first 20 minutes were an exercise in excruciating small talk. They discussed his final exams, his new apartment in Brooklyn, the logistics of his move. All the while, the unspoken topic sat between them like a third guest at the table. Finally, after the waiter had cleared their appetizer plates, Leo put down his fork and looked at her directly. "I went to see Dad last month in Philadelphia," he began, his voice low. "His apartment is small. He's selling insurance. He looks a decade older than he is." Catherine remained silent, her hands clasped in her lap. She wouldn't defend Richard, but she wouldn't slander him to his son either. "He told me his side of things." Leo continued, his gaze unwavering. "He said he made one bad investment, one mistake, and you used it as an excuse to take everything. He said you planned it for years, building your little company on the side, waiting for him to stumble so you could leave him with nothing." The words were a punch to the gut. It was Richard's delusion, polished and weaponized, now being fired from the mouth of her son. The old Catherine would have recoiled, either dissolving into tears or lashing out in defense. The new Catherine took a slow, deliberate breath. "And what do you believe, Leo?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Leo's composure finally cracked. A look of deep conflict and pain washed over his face. "I don't know what to believe, Mom. That's the problem. I read about you in magazines. I see your stores. I'm proud, I really am. But then I see him, my father, and he's a broken man. He says you're vindictive, that your success is a monument to your revenge. I feel like I'm being torn in half. I love you both, but the two worlds, the two stories, they don't make sense together." This was the debt, the explanation she owed her son. It was the final piece of her past that needed to be put in its proper place. "Leo," she said, leaning forward, "your father's story has a kernel of truth, as the best lies often do. He did make a bad investment, but that wasn't the reason I left. That was just the end of his story. The beginning of mine happened months earlier." She told him everything, not the sanitized version, but the raw, humiliating truth. She told him about the years of being made to feel small and invisible. She told him about Tiffany Sterling, and she told him in detail about the night of the dinner party, the laughter, the condescension, and the shattering of the vase. "Your father didn't just break a piece of pottery that night, Leo. He tried to break my spirit. He and that woman laughed as they did it. In that moment I realized I had a choice. I could either stay and let myself be ground down into dust, or I could leave with nothing but the hope that I could rebuild myself from the shards. I didn't leave him because he lost his money. I left him because long before that, he had made me lose myself." She paused, letting the words sink in. "My success. It isn't revenge. Revenge is a bitter, empty meal. This," she gestured around them at the life she had built, "is survival. It's the result of me finally deciding that my own dreams were worth something. I am sorry, more than I can ever say, that you have been caught in the fallout. It is a terrible burden for a son to carry. But I will not apologize for saving my own life." Tears welled in Leo's eyes as he listened. He was hearing not just a story, but the truth spoken with a clarity and conviction that his father's resentful narrative could never match. He was finally seeing his mother, not just as a parental figure, but as a person, a woman who had been deeply wronged and had fought her way back with unimaginable strength. He reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry I didn't see it." In that moment, the final shard of her old life clicked into place. Forging an empire was one thing. Earning back the unqualified respect and understanding of her child was another. It was a victory more profound than any business deal. The debt was paid. Her past was no longer a ghost haunting her. It was simply a story, a prologue to the magnificent life she was now living fully and completely on her own terms. Catherine Vance's journey reminds us that sometimes our deepest betrayals can become our greatest liberations. She transformed the echoes of cruel laughter into a chorus of admiration, building an empire not to prove her doubters wrong, but to prove herself right. Her story is a powerful testament to the idea that our true worth is not determined by who we are to someone else, but by who we have the courage to become for ourselves. The ultimate revenge isn't loud or vengeful. It's the quiet, undeniable hum of your own success, a life well lived, and a happiness that you and you alone have created. If Catherine's story of resilience and incredible transformation inspired you, please show your support by hitting the like button. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of their own inner strength. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories of triumph over adversity. Thank you for listening.